Hi, I'm Natalie. Last Tuesday, I received a phone call that changed everything. The manager of the Garden Bistro was calling to tell me my 8-year-old son Lucas was sitting alone at their restaurant, crying, with no money and no way to get home. My family had promised to take him out for his favorite pasta dinner before their big vacation. Instead, they left him there and boarded a plane to Cancun. When I asked my mother why, she said it simply, "We thought it would teach you both a lesson about depending on us too much." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That was 6 days ago. Today, they're calling me non-stop from their resort, begging me to wire them money because their credit cards got frozen. Funny how quickly the tables turn when you're the one stranded with nowhere to go. The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday evening when I finally got Lucas settled into bed. He'd been quiet since I picked him up from the Garden Bistro, clutching the small toy truck he always carried when he felt scared. The restaurant manager, Mr. Deluca, had been kind enough to let him wait in the back office for over 2 hours while they tried to reach me at work. Lucas told me he kept asking the waitress when Grandma Patty and Grandpa David were coming back, but she just kept giving him more crackers and avoiding his eyes. I should have seen it coming. The signs had been there for months, maybe even years, but I'd been too busy trying to hold everything together to notice the pattern forming around us like a noose tightening slowly. My family had always been what you might call complicated, but since my divorce from Lucas's father 3 years ago, their treatment of us had shifted from merely dismissive to something much darker. It started small, as these things always do. Forgotten invitations to family gatherings that I'd hear about through social media posts after the fact. Promises to babysit Lucas that would be canceled last minute, usually when I had already arranged my work schedule around their commitment. Comments about how I was struggling and needed to figure things out that always seemed to come wrapped in just enough concern to make me question whether I was being too sensitive. My mother Patty had perfected this particular art form. She worked as a real estate agent in the upscale Lake Oswego area, where image was everything, and problems were meant to be handled quietly and efficiently. She had a way of delivering criticism that felt like a gift, wrapped in soft words and accompanied by a gentle smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I just worry about you, honey," she'd say after making some comment about my apartment being too small or my job not paying enough. "I want what's best for you and Lucas." My father David was different but equally damaging in his own way. He'd made his money in tech during the boom years and had since retired to a life of golf and wine tasting. Where my mother was subtle, he was blunt. Where she offered backhanded support, he offered silence. David had a talent for being physically present but emotionally absent, nodding along with whatever Patty decided while contributing nothing meaningful to any conversation about our lives or struggles. Then there was my sister Brooke. 3 years younger than me, she'd married well and lived in a sprawling house in the hills with her husband Marcus and their twin daughters. Brooke had never known the particular exhaustion of being a single parent, had never had to choose between buying groceries and filling up the gas tank, had never sat in a school parking lot after work crying because she was 20 minutes late to pick up her child again. But she had plenty of opinions about how I was handling my life. My brother Tyler rounded out this perfect family portrait. Fresh out of college with a business degree and a trust fund cushion, he lived in a downtown Portland loft and worked at a startup that seemed to involve a lot of networking events and very little actual work. Tyler had the luxury of viewing my struggles as character flaws rather than circumstances, often suggesting that my problems would be solved if I just hustled harder or thought more positively. The vacation to Cancun had been planned for months. It was supposed to be a celebration of my parents' 35th wedding anniversary, a family trip to reconnect and make memories. Brooke and Tyler were going with their significant others. Originally, Lucas and I had been invited too, but as the date approached, it became clear that the invitation came with strings attached. "You know we love having Lucas around," Patty had said during one of our Sunday dinners at their house, "but this is really meant to be an adult trip. Maybe it would be better if you found someone to watch him while we're gone." I'd felt the familiar sting of exclusion, the way they could make me feel like an outsider in my own family with just a few carefully chosen words. But I'd pushed down the hurt and focused on the practical. I couldn't afford a week-long babysitter, and I certainly couldn't afford to take time off work to go on an expensive vacation. I'd smiled and nodded and said I understood. That's when Brooke had jumped in with what seemed like a solution. Actually, why don't we take Lucas with us for just the first day? We could pick him up after school, take him out for a nice dinner, maybe let him see us off at the airport. Make him feel included without the complications of bringing him on the whole trip. It had seemed reasonable at the time. Lucas had been excited about the prospect of a fancy dinner with his grandparents, aunt, and uncle. He'd picked out his best shirt and practiced his table manners. When they'd picked him up from school that Tuesday, he'd been practically vibrating with excitement, chattering about how he was going to order the spaghetti and meatballs and maybe even get dessert. I'd been working late at the marketing firm where I did freelance graphic design, trying to finish a project that had been giving me trouble for days. The client was particular and demanding, and I'd already had to redo the logo 3 times. I was so focused on getting the color scheme just right that I almost didn't answer when my phone rang at 7:30. "Is this Natalie Harper?" The voice on the other end was professional but concerned. "Yes, this is she. This is Frank Deluca, the manager at the Garden Bistro on Northwest 23rd. I have your son Lucas here, and I'm afraid there's been some confusion." My heart started beating faster. What kind of confusion? Is he okay? He's fine, physically. But the family members who brought him left about 2 hours ago, and he doesn't have a way to get home. Our staff has been keeping him company, but we close in an hour. I felt the room spin around me. Left? What do you mean they left? The older woman, she said something about catching a flight, and that you'd be along soon to pick him up. But when we tried to reach you using the number she gave us, it went straight to voicemail. I looked at my phone. 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. I'd been so absorbed in my work that I'd silenced all notifications. "I'll be right there," I managed to say, my hands already shaking as I saved my work and grabbed my keys. The drive to the restaurant felt like it took forever. Portland traffic was its usual nightmare, and every red light felt like a personal attack. I kept imagining Lucas sitting alone, wondering where everyone had gone, trying to be brave while internally falling apart. He was only 8 years old. He still sometimes crawled into my bed during thunderstorms. The idea of him abandoned in a public place, scared and confused, made me feel physically sick. When I finally arrived at the Garden Bistro, Mr. Deluca met me at the door. He was a kind-faced man in his 50s, with flour on his apron and genuine concern in his eyes. "Mrs. Harper? Your son is in the back office. He's been very brave, but I think he's ready to go home." Lucas was sitting in a chair that was too big for him, his legs dangling and his small hands folded in his lap. When he saw me, his carefully maintained composure crumbled. He ran to me and buried his face in my stomach, his small body shaking with the tears he'd been holding back. "Mama, I waited and waited," he whispered against my shirt. "Grandma Patty said you were coming soon, but then she left with everyone else. I thought maybe I did something wrong." My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces right there in that cramped office. I knelt down to his level and held his face in my hands. "You didn't do anything wrong, baby. Not one single thing. This is not your fault." Mr. Deluca cleared his throat gently. "The woman did pay for his meal," he said diplomatically, "but she seemed in a hurry. She mentioned something about a flight to catch, and said you'd be along shortly to collect him." I looked at this man, who had shown more kindness to my son in 2 hours than my family had shown in months. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for taking care of him."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"He's a good kid," Mr. Deluca replied simply. "Nobody should have to wait alone like that." On the drive home, Lucas was quiet except for the occasional sniffle. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, This little boy who'd been abandoned by the people who were supposed to love and protect him. When we got home, I made him hot chocolate and sat with him on the couch, trying to find words that could make sense of something so senseless. "Are they mad at us?" he asked finally, his voice small and uncertain. "No, sweetheart, they're not mad at you. They made a mistake. A big one, and it's not your fault." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them myself. This felt too deliberate to be a mistake. Leaving an 8-year-old child alone in a restaurant, even a nice one, wasn't something that happened by accident. It was a choice. A message, a line drawn in the sand. After Lucas was asleep, I sat in my small kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold, trying to process what had happened. I pulled out my phone and saw that I had 17 missed calls and 12 text messages, all from unknown numbers. None of them were from my family. I'd been dealing with their passive-aggressive behavior for years, their subtle ways of making me feel like a burden and a disappointment. But this crossed every line I'd ever imagined. This involved my child, my innocent 8-year-old son, who looked up to them and loved them despite their flaws. They'd used him as a pawn in whatever game they were playing with me, and that was unforgivable. I thought about calling them, demanding an explanation, yelling until my throat was raw. But something stopped me. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the beginning of clarity. Either way, I found myself opening my laptop and creating a new document instead. I started typing everything I could remember. The phone call from Mr. Deluca. Lucas's face when I found him in that office. The pattern of behavior that had led to this moment. I didn't know why I was documenting it all, but something inside me said it was important. Something told me this story wasn't over yet. The next morning, I woke up to a text message from Brooke, sent at what must have been around midnight Portland time. "Hope Lucas got home okay. Crazy flight delays. Couldn't wait any longer. You understand." I stared at that message for a long time. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they'd done. Just a casual dismissal of abandoning a child, followed by an assumption that I'd understand and forgive, the way I always had before. But this time was different. This time they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. This time they'd hurt my child, and that changed everything. I forwarded the text message to myself and saved it in the folder with my notes from the night before. I didn't respond. Instead, I got Lucas ready for school, packed his lunch with extra care, and walked him to the bus stop like every other morning. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The daughter who had spent years making excuses for her family's behavior was gone, replaced by a mother who would do anything to protect her child. As I watched Lucas climb onto the school bus, his backpack bouncing and his smile returning despite yesterday's trauma, I made a promise to both of us. This was the last time they would hurt him. Whatever came next, I would be ready for it. And this time, I wouldn't be facing it alone. The next few days passed in a strange blur of normalcy and underlying tension. I continued with our routine, getting Lucas ready for school, going to work, making dinner, helping with homework. But underneath it all, I felt like I was walking through a minefield, waiting for the next explosion. My family had gone radio silent since Brooke's dismissive text message, and their absence felt both relieving and ominous. Lucas seemed to bounce back with the resilience that children possess, but I caught him staring out the window sometimes with a faraway look in his eyes. When I asked him what he was thinking about, he'd shrug and say, "Nothing," in that way kids do when they're processing something too big for their vocabulary. I made sure to spend extra time with him each evening, reading stories and talking about his day, trying to rebuild the sense of security that had been shattered at the Garden Bistro. On Friday evening, my best friend Zoe Martinez stopped by with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. Zoe had been my anchor since my divorce, the kind of friend who shows up without being asked and somehow always knows exactly what you need. She worked as a social worker downtown and had seen enough family dysfunction to recognize the signs from a mile away. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said, setting the food containers on my small dining table. "What's going on?" I hadn't planned to tell anyone about what happened. Some part of me was still protecting my family's image, still making excuses for behavior that had no excuse. But sitting there with Zoe, who had never judged me for anything, the whole story came pouring out. The abandonment, the casual cruelty of the text message, the years of subtle undermining that had led to this moment. Zoe listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, picking at her low mane with unusual intensity. "Natalie," she said finally, "you know that what they did is actually illegal, right?" I looked up from my untouched food. "What do you mean?" "Abandoning a minor child in a public place. It's called child abandonment, and it's a crime in Oregon. They could face charges." The thought hadn't even occurred to me. I'd been so focused on the emotional betrayal that I hadn't considered the legal implications. But they're his grandparents. They weren't trying to hurt him. They were just what? Teaching you a lesson by traumatizing an 8-year-old? Zoe's voice was gentle but firm. "Honey, I see families every day who are struggling but doing their best. This isn't that. This is deliberate emotional abuse, and now they've escalated to putting Lucas in actual danger." That night, after Zoe left and Lucas was asleep, I found myself Googling Oregon child abandonment laws. What I found made my stomach turn. Zoe was right. What my family had done wasn't just cruel, it was criminal. The penalties ranged from fines to jail time, depending on the circumstances and the age of the child. I closed my laptop and walked to Lucas's room, standing in the doorway watching him sleep. His face was peaceful, one arm wrapped around his stuffed elephant, completely trusting that he was safe in our little apartment. They had put him at risk for what? To prove a point? To punish me for some perceived slight? The weekend brought an unexpected discovery. I was cleaning out my email inbox when I noticed a message in my spam folder from Tuesday afternoon, sent about an hour after my family would have left Lucas at the restaurant. The sender was my mother's email address, and the subject line read, "Family trip details." I opened it with shaking hands. It was a group email sent to Brooke, Tyler, and their partners, with me included almost as an afterthought. The message was chatty and excited, detailing their flight information, hotel reservations, and planned activities in Cancun. But what made my blood run cold was a single line buried in the middle of the text. "Dropped off some extra baggage before heading to the airport. Should make the trip much more relaxing." Extra baggage. That's how my mother had referred to my 8-year-old son in writing, to multiple family members, while he was sitting alone and scared in a restaurant wondering where everyone had gone. I took screenshots of the email and added them to the folder I'd been building since Tuesday night. The documentation was growing, and with it, a clearer picture of just how calculated this whole thing had been. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in the heat of the moment. This was planned, discussed, and executed, with the kind of cold precision that takes my breath away. Monday morning brought a call from Lucas's school. Mrs. Henderson, his third-grade teacher, wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss some changes in his behavior. My heart sank as I agreed to come in that afternoon. Lucas has always been such a bright, engaged student, Mrs. Henderson said as we sat in her classroom surrounded by colorful alphabet posters and student artwork. But this week he seemed withdrawn, distracted. During our family sharing circle on Wednesday, when it was his turn to talk about something special that happened over the weekend, he said his family went on vacation without him because he wasn't good enough to go. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. He said that? When I asked him to explain, he clammed up completely. I'm wondering if there's something going on at home that I should know about. I found myself caught between protecting my family's reputation and protecting my son's emotional well-being. For years, I'd prioritized the former, making excuses and covering up their behavior to maintain some illusion of family harmony. But looking at Mrs. Henderson's concerned face, thinking about Lucas carrying this burden alone at school, I made a choice. There was an incident last Tuesday, I said carefully. My family took Lucas out to dinner and then left him at the restaurant alone while they went to catch a flight. I had to pick him up after the manager called me. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened. They left him alone? An 8-year-old? Yes. And then they sent me a text message acting like it was no big deal, like I should just understand. Natalie, I have to ask this as a mandated reporter. Do you feel that Lucas is safe in his current environment? The question hung in the air between us. Was Lucas safe? He was safe with me, absolutely. But my family's behavior was escalating, becoming more unpredictable and more cruel. What would they do next to prove whatever twisted point they were trying to make? He's safe with me, I said finally. But I'm concerned about my family's behavior toward him. This isn't the first time they've done something that crossed a line, but it's definitely the worst. Mrs. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. I'm going to document our conversation and recommend that Lucas speak with our school counselor, if that's okay with you. Sometimes it helps children to have a neutral adult to talk through confusing situations. I agreed immediately. Lucas needed all the support he could get, especially since it was becoming clear that he couldn't count on his extended family for any. That evening, I was making dinner when my phone rang. The number was international, and my heart skipped a beat before I realized it was probably my family calling from Mexico. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from my father, and his tone was completely different from anything I'd heard from any of them since Tuesday. He sounded panicked. "Natalie, honey, we need you to call us back right away. There's been a problem with our credit cards and we're stuck at the resort. They're saying there's some kind of fraud hold and we can't access our accounts. We need you to wire us some money so we can pay our bill and get home. Please call as soon as you get this." I played the message 3 times, each time feeling a different emotion. First, shock at the irony. Then, anger at the assumption that I would drop everything to help them after what they'd done. Finally, something that felt almost like satisfaction. For the first time in my adult life, they needed me more than I needed them. Over the next 2 hours, my phone rang 14 more times. The voicemails grew increasingly desperate. My mother's voice, usually so controlled and measured, became shrill with panic. Brooke left a message that was half pleading, half demanding. Tyler's contribution was a rambling explanation of how this was somehow the hotel's fault and definitely not their responsibility. I didn't call back. Instead, I ordered pizza for Lucas and me, and we had a nice, quiet dinner while my phone continued to buzz on the counter. When Lucas asked who kept calling, I told him it was probably a telemarketer and turned the volume down. The next morning brought a new development. Zoe called me at work, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Did you know your sister posted about their vacation on social media?" My stomach dropped. What did she post? Pictures from their resort, talking about what a perfect family trip it is. And Natalie, she tagged it with hashtags about family bonding and making memories. There are photos of all of them at dinner, at the beach, by the pool. She's acting like this is some kind of celebration. I asked Zoe to screenshot everything and send it to me. When the images came through, I felt that familiar combination of hurt and rage that my family specialized in provoking. There they were, living their best life at a luxury resort, posting about family togetherness while Lucas was meeting with a school counselor because he thought he wasn't good enough to be included. But it was the caption on one particular photo that pushed me over the edge. A group shot of all of them raising cocktails in a toast, with the words, "Sometimes you have to cut the dead weight to really enjoy life. Cheers to family who show up." Dead weight. They were referring to my son, my beautiful, innocent 8-year-old son, as dead weight. And they were celebrating getting rid of us. I forwarded the screenshots to the same folder, where I'd been keeping all their other evidence of cruelty. The collection was becoming substantial, a digital paper trail of escalating emotional abuse that painted a clear picture of their calculated behavior. That afternoon, Mrs. Henderson called again. "Lucas had his session with our counselor today," she said. "I wanted to give you a heads up that some concerning things came up in their conversation." My hands tightened on the phone. What kind of things? He's been having nightmares about being left places. He told Mrs. Garcia that he's worried about going to family events because he's afraid they'll forget him again. But more concerning, he's started to blame himself. He thinks he must have done something wrong to make them not want him around. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of my son's pain like a physical ache in my chest. What can I do to help him? Mrs. Garcia would like to continue meeting with him weekly for a while. and she suggested that you might want to consider limiting his contact with the family members who caused this trauma, at least until he's had time to process and heal. It was the permission I hadn't known I was waiting for. A professional, someone whose job it was to protect children, was telling me that my instinct to shield Lucas from my family was not only reasonable but necessary. "I think that's a good idea," I said. That evening, while Lucas was at his friend Danny's house for a playdate, I sat down and wrote an email. Not to my family, but to Catherine Reynolds, a family law attorney whose name Zoe had given me. I attached every screenshot, every voicemail transcript, every piece of evidence I'd been collecting. I explained the situation clearly and objectively, focusing on the facts rather than my emotions. Her response came within an hour. "Ms. Harper, I've reviewed your documentation. I'd like to schedule a consultation as soon as possible. What your family did constitutes child abandonment under Oregon law, and the evidence you've compiled is quite compelling. Please call my office first thing tomorrow morning." I sat in my quiet apartment, laptop closed, phone silent for the first time in days. My family was stranded in Mexico, frantically trying to reach me for help I had no intention of providing. My son was slowly healing with the support of trained professionals. And for the first time since Tuesday, I felt like I wasn't completely powerless in this situation. The dynamic was shifting. They had pushed too far, hurt the wrong person, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And now, finally, there would be consequences. I opened my laptop one more time and created a new document. At the top, I typed, "Timeline of abuse and abandonment, Harper family." Below that, I began listing every incident I could remember, dating back years. The missed birthdays, the broken promises, the subtle cruelties, the outright abandonment. As I typed, I realized I wasn't just documenting their behavior anymore. I was building a case. And for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't afraid of what my family might think about it. My meeting with Catherine Reynolds took place in a sleek downtown office that overlooked the Willamette River. She was a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and an immediate presence that made me feel both nervous and hopeful. The conference room where we sat was lined with law books and had the kind of heavy silence that seemed to demand truth. "I've reviewed all the materials you sent," Catherine said, spreading printed copies of my documentation across the polished table. "This level of systematic emotional abuse, culminating in child abandonment, presents several legal avenues we could pursue." She walked me through the options methodically. Criminal charges for child abandonment, a restraining order to protect Lucas from further contact. Documentation for potential custody issues if my ex-husband ever tried to use this situation against me. Each possibility felt both validating and terrifying. "The strongest case we have," Catherine continued, "is built around the abandonment incident itself, but these other materials show a clear pattern of behavior that supports our position. The email referring to your son as extra baggage, the social media posts celebrating his exclusion, the documented impact on his mental health through the school's observations. It all paints a very clear picture." I found myself gripping the arms of my chair. What would happen if we moved forward with criminal charges? In Oregon, child abandonment in the first degree is a Class C felony. Given that your son is under 10 years old and was left in a public place without adequate supervision or means to care for himself, that's the charge that would apply. We're looking at potential jail time, significant fines, and mandatory parenting classes, though as first-time offenders they might plead down to lesser charges. The idea of my parents and siblings potentially facing jail time felt surreal. These were people who had raised me, who had been present for birthday parties and Christmas mornings, who I'd spent decades trying to please and understand. But they had also abandoned my child in a restaurant and called him dead weight while celebrating their freedom from us. "There's something else you should know," Catherine said, consulting her notes. "I had my investigator do some preliminary research on your family's financial situation. Your parents' accounts being frozen isn't likely a fraud issue. It appears they've been experiencing some significant financial difficulties that they've kept hidden." My heart stopped. "What kind of difficulties?" "Your father's retirement investments took a major hit in some recent market volatility. Your mother's real estate business has been struggling with the downturn in the luxury market. From what we can determine, This vacation was likely funded by credit that they're now unable to cover. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. The sudden escalation in their cruelty toward Lucas and me. The expensive family vacation that excluded the family members who couldn't contribute financially. The desperation in their phone calls for money. This wasn't just about control or family dynamics. This was about money, and we had become convenient scapegoats for their financial stress. So when they abandoned Lucas, I said slowly, they were essentially eliminating the family members who cost money rather than contribute it. That's how it appears. And it makes their behavior even more calculating than it initially seemed. I left Catherine's office with a manila folder full of legal documents and a decision deadline of 1 week. She needed to know whether I wanted to pursue criminal charges, civil action, or simply use the threat of legal action to establish clear boundaries. The choice felt enormous, life-altering in ways I was still trying to understand. That evening, Lucas and I were making spaghetti when my phone rang. The international number was becoming familiar, and this time I decided to answer. "Natalie, thank God." My mother's voice was strained and desperate. "We've been trying to reach you for days. We're in serious trouble here." "I know," I said calmly, stirring the pasta sauce while Lucas set the table. "I got your messages. Then why haven't you called back? We need you to wire us money immediately. The hotel is threatening to call the police if we can't settle our bill." The irony was not lost on me. They were afraid of police involvement in their financial troubles, while completely oblivious to the potential criminal charges they were facing for what they'd done to Lucas. "I can't help you," I said simply. "What do you mean you can't help? You're our daughter. This is what family does for each other." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Is it? Is abandoning an 8-year-old in a restaurant what family does for each other? There was a pause. Then my father's voice came on the line. "Natalie, we can discuss what happened when we get home. Right now, we need your help. This is an emergency. It was an emergency when your grandson was left alone and scared, wondering what he'd done wrong to make his family disappear. But that didn't seem to concern you then." "Don't be dramatic." Brooke's voice joined the call, sharp with frustration. "He was fine. He was in a safe place. You're blowing this completely out of proportion." "Safe?" I felt my composure slipping. "He's been having nightmares. He's meeting with a school counselor because he thinks he's not good enough for his own family. You called him dead weight on social media while toasting to cutting him out of your lives. You saw that post?" Quote. Brooke's voice went quiet. "I saw all of it. The group email calling my son extra baggage, the celebration photos. The hashtags about family bonding while excluding the actual children in this family. I've seen everything, and I've documented everything." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, my mother spoke again, her voice different, more careful. "Natalie, we're family. Whatever misunderstandings have happened, we can work through them. But right now, we need you to focus on helping us get home." "No," I said firmly. "I'm focusing on helping my son heal from what you did to him. I'm focusing on protecting him from any further harm. And I'm focusing on making sure there are consequences for abandoning a child." "Consequences?" Tyler's voice jumped into the conversation. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've spoken with a lawyer. It means what you did is called child abandonment, and it's a felony in Oregon. It means your behavior is documented, time-stamped, and legally actionable." The explosion of voices was immediate. My mother's shocked denials, my father's angry assertions that I was being unreasonable, Brooke's accusations that I was vindictive and unstable, Tyler's threats about what this would do to the family's reputation. I listened to the chaos of their panic for about 30 seconds before I quietly hung up. Lucas looked up from his homework at the kitchen table. "Was that them?" "Yes, sweetheart. Are they still mad at us?" I sat down beside him, choosing my words carefully. "They're not mad at you, Lucas. You didn't do anything wrong, and you never have. They made some very bad choices, and now they're dealing with the consequences of those choices. Over the next few days, the calls became constant. When I stopped answering, they started texting. When I blocked their regular numbers, they began calling from the hotel, from other guests, phones, from numbers I didn't recognize. The messages grew increasingly desperate, then angry, then threatening, then pleading again. The cycle was familiar but amplified. It was the same pattern they'd used my entire life. Create a crisis, expect me to fix it, become abusive when I couldn't or wouldn't, then love bomb me back into compliance. But this time felt different, because the stakes were different. This time they had hurt my child, and that had awakened something protective in me that their manipulation couldn't touch. Zoe came over Thursday evening with pizza and wine, as had become our routine since the abandonment incident. She sat on my couch reading through the printouts of their increasingly unhinged text messages while I cleaned up the kitchen. "Natalie," she said finally, "you need to see this." She handed me her phone, open to Brooke's Instagram account. The latest post was a long caption over a photo of a Cancun sunset, titled, "When Family Shows Their True Colors." The text was a masterpiece of manipulation and victim playing that painted me as a vindictive, jealous sister who was holding the family hostage over a simple misunderstanding. According to Brooke's version of events, they had made an innocent mistake with timing and were now being punished by a sister who had always been resentful of their success. She painted their financial crisis as my fault, suggesting that my refusal to help was evidence of my character flaws. The post was carefully crafted to generate sympathy while positioning me as the villain in their story. But what made my blood run cold were the comments. Dozens of responses from friends and acquaintances expressing shock at my behavior, offering to help my stranded family, condemning me for abandoning them in their time of need. People I had known for years, people who had never heard my side of the story, were accepting Brooke's narrative without question and turning against me publicly. "They're trying to isolate you," Zoe said quietly. "It's a classic abuser tactic. Make you the villain, turn your support system against you, force you back into compliance by making the consequences of resistance too painful to bear." I scrolled through comment after comment, each one feeling like a small betrayal. Neighbors who had smiled at Lucas and me in the grocery store were now questioning my character in writing. Former colleagues were expressing concern about my mental state. Extended family members were weighing in with their disappointment in my choices. "It's working," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Look at this, everyone believes them." "Everyone believes the story they're telling," Zoe corrected. "But you have something they don't have. You have the truth, and you have proof." That night, after Lucas was asleep, I sat in my living room with my laptop and began typing. Not a legal document this time, but a simple, factual account of what had actually happened. I included screenshots of the extra baggage email, photos of the social media posts celebrating their freedom from us, documentation from Lucas's school about his emotional trauma, even photos of the receipts showing the timeline of events. I wrote about the years of subtle abuse, the pattern of making me feel like a burden while expecting me to solve every crisis. I wrote about finding my 8-year-old son alone and scared in a restaurant, about his nightmares and his belief that he wasn't good enough for his own family. I wrote about their immediate response being to demand money rather than apologize for traumatizing a child. When I finished, I had a clear, factual account that let the evidence speak for itself. No drama, no emotional manipulation, just the truth supported by documentation that couldn't be disputed. But I didn't post it. Instead, I saved it as a draft and went to bed. Friday morning brought a knock on my door that made my heart race. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman in a professional suit holding an official-looking envelope. "Natalie Harper? I'm serving you with legal papers on behalf of the Harper family. You've been named in a civil lawsuit for emotional distress and family interference." I accepted the papers with shaking hands, my mind reeling. They were suing me, while stranded in Mexico because of their own financial irresponsibility. After abandoning my child, they were actually suing me for refusing to bail them out of their consequences. I called Catherine Reynolds immediately. "I expected something like this," she said after I read her the summons over the phone. "It's a desperation move. They're trying to pressure you into dropping your own potential case by making you defend against theirs. But Natalie, this actually works in our favor. How does being sued work in our favor? Because now they've made this a public legal matter. Everything we've documented becomes admissible evidence in defending against their suit. And more importantly, their lawsuit creates a paper trail that makes it impossible for them to deny what happened or claim it was all a misunderstanding. What do we do now? Now we file a countersuit for child abandonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and defamation. And Natalie, I think it's time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. That afternoon, I picked up Lucas from school and took him to his favorite park. As he played on the swings, laughing with the carefree joy that children possess, I watched him and made my decision. They had forced this fight by abandoning him, escalated it by refusing to take responsibility, and now they'd made it public by filing a lawsuit. I pulled out my phone and opened the draft of my factual account. Without allowing myself to second guess, I posted it to my social media accounts with a simple introduction. Since my family has chosen to make this matter public through legal action and social media campaigns, I feel it's important that people know what actually happened. Within an hour, the post had been shared dozens of times. The comments section filled with support from people who had seen through Brooke's manipulation, horror from people learning the truth for the first time, and apologies from some who had initially believed my family's version of events. But more importantly, my phone started ringing with calls from local news outlets who had been monitoring the story. The narrative was shifting, and this time, it was shifting toward the truth. That evening, as Lucas and I made dinner together, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt powerful. Not angry, not vindictive, just aware of my own strength, and determined to use it to protect my son. They had wanted a fight. Now they were going to get one. But this time, they weren't fighting against the daughter who had spent decades trying to earn their approval. They were fighting against a mother who would do anything to protect her child, and they had no idea what that meant. The local news interview was scheduled for Tuesday morning at the small community center where Lucas attended after-school programs. The reporter, Maria Santos from Channel 8, had been following the story since my social media post went viral over the weekend. She was a seasoned journalist who specialized in family court issues and child welfare cases, and she had the kind of direct, no-nonsense approach that made me feel like she genuinely wanted to understand what had happened. "Tell me about the evening you received the call from the restaurant," Maria said, her cameraman adjusting the lighting behind her. We sat in the quiet children's library, surrounded by colorful picture books and tiny chairs, a setting that somehow made the contrast with my family's cruelty even more stark. I walked her through the timeline carefully, sticking to facts rather than emotions. The excitement Lucas had felt about dinner with his grandparents, the realization that they had left him alone, the 2-hour wait with strangers while his family boarded a plane to Mexico. As I spoke, Maria occasionally glanced at her notes, cross-referencing details with the documentation I had provided. "Your family has filed a lawsuit claiming you've caused them emotional distress by refusing to help them return from their vacation. How do you respond to that?" I respond by asking what message it sends to my son if I rescue the people who abandoned him from the consequences of their own choices. Lucas is 8 years old. He's learning about responsibility, about treating people with kindness, about what family means. I can't teach him those values while simultaneously showing him that his feelings and safety matter less than his grandparents' comfort. The interview lasted 45 minutes, covering everything from the pattern of emotional manipulation I'd endured over the years to the current legal proceedings. When it ended, Maria shook my hand with genuine warmth. "This will air tomorrow night," she said. "I want you to be prepared that your family's legal team will likely respond publicly. These things have a way of escalating once they hit the airwaves." She was right. By Wednesday evening, social media was buzzing with reactions to the news segment. The story had been picked up by regional outlets and was spreading across family advocacy groups and parenting forums. Most of the response was supportive, with other parents sharing their own experiences of toxic family dynamics and praising my decision to prioritize my child's well-being over family expectations. But there was also a coordinated pushback that felt too organized to be organic. New social media accounts with generic names began flooding the comments sections with identical talking points about vindictive daughters and family loyalty. The messaging was so consistent that it felt professionally crafted, which made me wonder if my family had hired a public relations firm to manage their crisis. Thursday morning brought confirmation of that suspicion. Brooke appeared on a rival news station via video call from their Cancun hotel room, flanked by our parents' Aunt Tyler. She looked polished and media-ready, despite their supposed financial crisis, wearing professional makeup and jewelry that certainly hadn't been purchased during their budget vacation. "My sister has always struggled with jealousy and resentment," Brooke said to the interviewer, her voice carrying the perfect blend of sadness and concern that she'd perfected over the years. "We made a simple mistake with timing, and instead of talking to us about it like family should, she's chosen to destroy our reputations and leave us stranded in a foreign country." The interviewer, a man who seemed more interested in sensational conflict than factual reporting, lobbed softball questions that allowed my family to paint themselves as victims of my vindictiveness. They spoke about their shock at my legal threats, their heartbreak over being cut off from their grandson, their fear that they might not be able to return home because of my refusal to help. What struck me most was how smoothly they lied. There was no mention of the extra baggage email, no acknowledgement of the social media posts celebrating their freedom from Lucas and me, no reference to the years of financial pressure and emotional manipulation that had led to this moment. They had constructed an alternate reality where they were loving grandparents being punished for a minor oversight by an unstable daughter. But they made one crucial mistake. When the interviewer asked about the restaurant incident specifically, my mother said, "We told the staff that Natalie would be along shortly to pick up Lucas. We never intended for him to be alone." I rewound the segment 3 times to make sure I'd heard correctly. She had just admitted, on camera, that they had deliberately left Lucas at the restaurant expecting me to retrieve him. It wasn't a mistake or an oversight. It was an intentional decision to abandon him there. Catherine Reynolds called me within an hour of the broadcast. "Did you see it?" she asked without preamble. "Every word. Your mother just gave us a confession on live television. She admitted to intentionally leaving Lucas at the restaurant. That statement alone significantly strengthens our criminal case." I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because the truth was finally coming to light in ways that couldn't be disputed. Sadness because these were people I had once loved and trusted, and watching them lie so effortlessly on television was like watching strangers wear the faces of my family. "There's more," Catherine continued. "My investigator has uncovered some interesting information about their financial situation. It appears this isn't their first legal issue. They've been involved in several civil suits over unpaid debts, including one filed by their homeowners association just last month. So this pattern of creating problems and expecting others to solve them isn't new. Not at all. And it gives us additional context for understanding why they targeted you and Lucas. You were convenient scapegoats for stress that had been building for months. That evening, Lucas and I were making tacos when my phone began ringing incessantly. I let the first few calls go to voicemail, but when the caller switched to texting and the messages became increasingly aggressive, I realized my family had finally made it home from Mexico. "Where are you?" the first text read. "We need to talk right now." The messages that followed were a rapid-fire mixture of demands, threats, and emotional manipulation. They wanted me to meet them at their house immediately. They accused me of coaching Lucas to lie to his school counselor. They threatened to seek custody of him if I didn't drop the legal proceedings. They promised to make my life miserable until I came to my senses. The final message, sent from my father's phone, was the most revealing. "You have 24 hours to retract everything publicly and drop the charges, or we'll make sure you never work in this city again. We have connections you don't even know about." I screenshotted every message and forwarded them to Catherine, along with a note. "I think they just added intimidation and threats to their list of legal problems." Her response was immediate. "File a police report tonight. These constitute criminal threats and witness intimidation." The next morning, I sat in the lobby of the Portland Police Bureau's East Precinct with a thick folder of evidence and a determination I'd never felt before. Detective Robert Chen, who specialized in family violence cases, listened to my account with the kind of focused attention that made me feel heard rather than judged. "You've been thorough with your documentation," he said, flipping through the printed emails, social media screenshots, and phone records. This level of evidence makes our job significantly easier. What happens now? Now we file formal charges for child abandonment, and we add charges for criminal threats based on these text messages. Your family members will be arrested and processed through the system like any other defendants. The weight of those words settled over me slowly. My parents, who had raised me and attended my school plays and taught me to ride a bike, were going to be arrested. My siblings, who had shared bedrooms and family vacations and inside jokes with me for decades, would have criminal records. The family that had shaped my entire identity was about to face legal consequences that would change all of our lives forever. But when I thought about Lucas, about the way he'd looked sitting alone in that restaurant office, about his nightmares and his belief that he wasn't good enough for his own family, I knew I was making the right choice. Sometimes protecting the people you love means allowing the people who hurt them to face consequences. Saturday morning brought news that spread through our community like wildfire. My parents, Brooke and Tyler, had been arrested at their respective homes and booked into the Multnomah County Detention Center. The charges included child abandonment in the first degree, criminal threatening, and intimidation. Their mugshots appeared on the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office website within hours, and by afternoon they were circulating on social media. I felt no satisfaction seeing those photos, just a hollow kind of sadness. These were people who had once been the center of my world, and now they were criminal defendants in a case that would define the rest of our relationships. But I also felt something else: relief. For the first time in my adult life, they were facing real consequences for their behavior, instead of expecting me to absorb the impact of their choices. The community response was swift and divided. The parents at Lucas's school were largely supportive, understanding that I was protecting my child from people who had proven they couldn't be trusted with his safety. But there was also pushback from people who believed that family should stick together regardless of circumstances, who saw my decision to press charges as an overreaction to a situation that should have been handled privately. The most painful responses came from extended family members who reached out to express their disappointment in me for tearing the family apart. Cousins I'd grown up with, aunts and uncles who had been part of my childhood, former family friends who felt I should have found a way to work things out without involving the legal system. Each critical message felt like another small betrayal, another person choosing the comfort of maintaining family mythology over the reality of protecting a child. But for every person who questioned my choices, there were two more who shared their own stories of family abuse, who thanked me for speaking out, who said my decision had given them courage to set their own boundaries. The support came from unexpected places. Mrs. Henderson sent a card signed by Lucas's entire third-grade class, with messages of encouragement and drawings of superheroes. The other parents in our apartment complex organized a meal train to help during the stress of the legal proceedings. Even Mr. Deluca from the Garden Bistro stopped by to check on Lucas and offer to testify about what he'd witnessed that evening. "What you did for your son took real courage," he said, sitting in our small living room with a cup of coffee. "I've been in the restaurant business for 30 years, and I've seen a lot of family situations. What happened that night wasn't normal, and you were right to take it seriously." Sunday evening, as Lucas and I were reading bedtime stories, he looked up at me with the kind of serious expression that 8-year-olds get when they're processing something important. "Mama, are Grandma and Grandpa in jail because of me?" My heart broke a little at the question. Despite everything we'd talked about, despite the counseling and the reassurance, he was still carrying guilt that belonged entirely to the adults who had failed him. "No, sweetheart," I said, sitting on the edge of his bed and smoothing his hair. "They're in jail because of choices they made. They chose to leave you alone when they should have made sure you were safe. They chose to send mean messages when they should have apologized. They chose to blame other people, instead of taking responsibility for their mistakes. But if I hadn't needed dinner that night, none of this would have happened." I felt the familiar fury rise in my chest, not at Lucas but at the people who had made an innocent child believe he was responsible for adult failures. "Lucas, listen to me very carefully. You are 8 years old. Your only job is to be a kid, to learn and grow and be happy. It's the adults' job to keep you safe and loved. When they don't do that job, when they hurt you instead of protecting you, that's never your fault. Never." He nodded slowly, and I could see him working to believe me despite the guilt they had planted in his mind. It would take time, probably years of therapy and patient reassurance, to undo the damage they had caused in a single evening. But we would do that work together, and he would learn that he was worthy of love that didn't come with conditions or threats. Monday morning brought a call from Catherine with news that would change the trajectory of the entire case. They want to negotiate a plea deal, she said. Apparently, spending the weekend in jail gave them some perspective on the seriousness of their situation. What kind of deal? Guilty pleas to reduce charges in exchange for no jail time, substantial fines, mandatory parenting classes, and a no-contact order protecting you and Lucas. They would also have to issue a public apology acknowledging what they did and retract their civil lawsuit against you. I was quiet for a long moment, processing the offer. It would mean vindication, without the trauma of a prolonged trial. It would mean official acknowledgement that they had committed crimes against my son. It would mean legal protection from further harassment. But it would also mean they wouldn't face the full consequences of their actions. No jail time for people who had abandoned a child and then tried to intimidate the mother who sought justice. I need to think about it, I said finally. Of course. But Natalie, there's something else you should know. The prosecutor is planning to recommend this deal regardless of your input. The jail is overcrowded, they're first-time offenders, and child abandonment cases rarely result in significant prison time. So they win? No, Catherine said firmly. They have criminal records now. They've been publicly exposed for what they are. They've lost access to their grandson and their ability to manipulate you. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. She was right. The people who had once controlled my life through emotional manipulation and financial pressure were now criminal defendants with restricted access to my son. The dynamic that had defined my entire adult relationship with them was permanently altered in ways that no amount of money or charm could undo. But more importantly, Lucas was safe. He was healing. He was learning that he mattered enough for someone to fight for him, even when that fight was difficult and costly. That evening, as I watched him playing happily with his toys, chattering about his day at school, without the shadow of anxiety that had haunted him for weeks, I knew what my answer would be. I accepted the plea deal on a Wednesday morning in November, exactly 6 months after that phone call from the Garden Bistro changed everything. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired and worn. My family sat at the defendant's table with their attorney, a sharp-dressed woman who specialized in damage control for wealthy clients facing embarrassing charges. They looked different than I remembered. My father's hair had gone completely gray at the temples, and he wore a suit that seemed too big for his shrinking frame. My mother sat rigidly beside him, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Brooke and Tyler flanked them, both staring straight ahead with the kind of forced composure that comes from media training and desperation. Judge Patricia Moreau read the terms of the agreement in a steady voice that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Guilty pleas to child endangerment and criminal harassment. 2 years of supervised probation. $5,000 in fines each. Mandatory completion of parenting and anger management courses. A no-contact order protecting Lucas and me for the duration of their probation. Do you understand these terms and accept them voluntarily? Quote, Judge Moreau asked each of them in turn. 4 quiet yes responses, barely audible even in the silent courtroom. The court also requires a public statement acknowledging your actions and their impact on the minor child involved. This statement will be published in the Oregonian and read at a press conference. Do you agree to these terms? Another round of reluctant affirmations. I watched from the gallery as the people who had shaped my entire understanding of family became convicted criminals. There was no satisfaction in it, just a hollow acknowledgement that this was how their story ended. Not with reconciliation or understanding, but with legal documents and supervised probation. The press conference was held the following Friday on the courthouse steps. I wasn't required to attend, but Catherine thought it would be important for me to witness their public admission of guilt. Lucas was at school, safely removed from the media circus that had consumed our lives for the past 6 months. My mother approached the podium first, her prepared statement trembling in her hands. The confident real estate agent who had spent decades managing other people's crises looked fragile and uncertain in the afternoon sunlight. "We want to acknowledge that we made serious errors in judgment that put our grandson Lucas in danger," she read, her voice barely carrying over the traffic noise from the street below. "We left him alone at a restaurant without ensuring his safety or well-being. We then compounded that mistake by refusing to take responsibility for our actions, and by attempting to manipulate and intimidate his mother when she sought to protect him." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "We understand that our behavior caused significant emotional trauma to Lucas, who trusted us to keep him safe. We also acknowledge that our treatment of his mother, Natalie, included years of emotional manipulation and financial coercion that created an unhealthy family dynamic." The reporters scribbled notes and adjusted their cameras as she struggled through the remainder of the statement. When she finished, she stepped back from the microphone without making eye contact with anyone, including her own legal team. The questions from the press were predictably harsh. Had they learned anything from the experience? Did they regret their actions? Did they hope to reconcile with their daughter and grandson? Their attorney fielded most of the inquiries with practiced non-answers, but one reporter managed to direct a question specifically to Brooke. "Ms. Harper-Williams, you posted on social media that you were celebrating cutting dead weight from your family vacation. Do you still stand by that characterization of your 8-year-old nephew?" Brooke's carefully maintained composure cracked for just a moment, and I saw something that might have been genuine shame cross her face. "No," she said quietly. "That was cruel and inexcusable. Lucas is an innocent child who deserved better from all of us. It was the closest thing to a real apology any of them had offered, and it caught me off guard. For just a second, I glimpsed the sister I'd grown up with, the one who used to braid my hair and share secrets under blanket forts. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the professional mask she'd worn throughout the legal proceedings. The civil lawsuit they had filed against me was formally dismissed the following week, along with their demand for nearly $50,000 in damages for emotional distress and reputational harm. Catherine had argued successfully that you can't sue someone for refusing to enable your own criminal behavior, and the judge agreed with pointed commentary about frivolous litigation. More importantly, the no-contact order meant that Lucas and I could finally breathe without looking over our shoulders. No more unexpected visits, no more manipulative phone calls, no more social media campaigns designed to turn our community against us. For the first time in his young life, Lucas was completely free from their influence. The change in him was gradual but unmistakable. The nightmares stopped first, then the anxious checking to make sure I was still there when he woke up in the morning. His school counselor, Mrs. Garcia, reported that he was participating more in class activities and had stopped asking if he'd done something wrong when minor things went awry. Most tellingly, he started talking about the future with the kind of excitement that healthy children possess. He made plans for summer camp, talked about wanting to learn to play guitar, expressed interest in joining the school's science club. These weren't extraordinary ambitions, but they represented something crucial. Lucas was beginning to believe that he deserved good things, and that the adults in his life would support his dreams rather than use them as weapons. The financial impact of the legal proceedings was significant but manageable. Catherine's fees, the time off work for court appearances, the stress-induced medical bills, it all added up to more than I'd ever spent on anything except housing. But our community had rallied around us in ways I'd never expected. A GoFundMe campaign started by other parents at Lucas's school raised enough to cover most of the legal costs. Local businesses offered everything from free meals to discounted services. Most meaningfully, I began receiving messages from other parents who had been inspired by our story to address toxic family dynamics in their own lives. Women who had been financially manipulated by relatives, parents who had been guilted into exposing their children to harmful family members, adult children who had spent decades making excuses for inexcusable behavior. One message particularly stayed with me. It was from a mother in Seattle, whose own parents had abandoned her teenage daughter at a shopping mall as punishment for some perceived slight. She had been too afraid of family backlash to press charges, but seeing our case gave her the courage to file a police report and seek a protective order. "You showed me that protecting our children is more important than protecting family secrets," she wrote. "My daughter is sleeping peacefully for the first time in months because she knows I chose her over them." Those messages reminded me that our story wasn't just about one abandoned child or one dysfunctional family. It was about the broader pattern of normalized abuse that gets hidden behind closed doors and family loyalty. It was about the children who suffer in silence because the adults who should protect them are too afraid of conflict to take action. By spring, Lucas and I had settled into a new rhythm of life. I'd taken a full-time position with a marketing firm downtown, drawn by their family-friendly policies and the stability of regular benefits. Lucas thrived in after-school programs and weekend activities that didn't require navigating complicated family dynamics or wondering whether he'd said or done something wrong. We made new traditions that belonged entirely to us: Saturday morning pancakes with elaborate toppings, evening walks around the neighborhood where Lucas could ride his bike without supervision, bedtime stories that lasted as long as he wanted, with no one rushing us toward an arbitrary schedule determined by other people's needs. The apartment that had once felt cramped and temporary began to feel like home in ways our old life never had. We painted his bedroom walls with his favorite superhero colors. I hung artwork he'd made at school in the living room, treating his creations with the same reverence most people reserved for expensive prints. We adopted a rescue cat named Whiskers who seemed to understand that Lucas needed an uncomplicated relationship with a living creature that would never abandon or manipulate him. Summer brought an unexpected opportunity. The Portland Family Justice Center, where I'd received counseling and legal referrals during the worst months of our ordeal, offered me a part-time consulting position, helping other parents navigate similar situations. The work involved reviewing cases, providing emotional support to families in crisis, and occasionally speaking at training seminars for social workers and family court personnel. It felt like coming full circle, using our painful experience to help other families find their way through similar trauma. The first case I consulted on involved a grandfather who had been financially abusing his daughter and grandson, creating debt in the child's name and then threatening homelessness when the mother tried to establish boundaries. The parallels to our own experience were striking, but so was the mother's determination to protect her child despite the emotional cost. "I keep thinking I should be able to find a way to fix this that doesn't involve lawyers and court orders," she told me during our first meeting. "He's my father. There has to be some way to make him understand that what he's doing is hurting my son." I recognized that hope, the belief that love and logic could overcome years of established patterns. I'd spent decades clinging to the same fantasy, convinced that if I just found the right words or made the right gestures, my family would see me as worthy of basic respect and consideration. "Sometimes," I told her gently, "the most loving thing you can do is allow people to face the consequences of their choices. Your father might never understand that he's hurting his grandson, but he doesn't have to understand it for you to stop allowing it to continue." It was advice I'd learned the hard way, wisdom purchased with months of sleepless nights, and the kind of grief that comes from accepting that some relationships are too damaged to salvage. But it was also liberating wisdom. The recognition that I couldn't control other people's choices, but I could control my own responses to those choices. The one-year anniversary of the restaurant incident passed quietly. Lucas was at overnight camp, his first time away from me since the abandonment, participating in a week-long science program that had him practically vibrating with excitement. I spent the evening alone in our apartment, reading and enjoying the kind of peaceful solitude that had once felt lonely, but now felt restorative. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and for a moment, my heart rate spiked with the old fear that my family had found a way around the no-contact order. But the message was from Mr. Deluca at the Garden Bistro. "Thinking of you and Lucas today," it read. "You both showed incredible strength this year. Hope you're doing well." It was a small gesture, but it reminded me of how many people had supported us through the darkest period of our lives. Not the people I'd expected or hoped would stand by us, but the ones who showed up when it mattered. The restaurant manager who treated my frightened son with kindness. The teacher who recognized trauma and responded with resources. The lawyer who took our case seriously when others might have dismissed it as a family squabble. 2 weeks later, Lucas returned from camp with stories about new friends, science experiments, and plans to attend again next summer. He'd grown taller in just 1 week, and his confidence had expanded to match his physical growth. Watching him unpack his duffel bag and chatter about his adventures, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made the right choices, even when those choices were difficult and costly. That evening, as we were making dinner together, Lucas looked up from the vegetables he was cutting with careful concentration. "Mama," he said thoughtfully, "do you think they ever think about us?" I knew exactly who he meant, though we rarely discussed them anymore. The question wasn't loaded with the old anxiety about whether he'd done something wrong or wasn't good enough. It was simple curiosity about people who had once been important in his life. "I think they probably do," I said honestly. "But what matters isn't whether they think about us. What matters is that we're safe and happy and taking good care of each other." He nodded, satisfied with that answer in the way children are when they feel secure in their primary relationships. The people who had once dominated our emotional landscape had become distant figures, remembered but no longer powerful enough to dictate our daily happiness or sense of worth. As autumn arrived and Lucas started 4th grade, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since that terrible Tuesday evening. The frightened, abandoned child who had waited for hours in a restaurant office had become a confident boy who raised his hand eagerly in class and invited friends over for playdates. The exhausted single mother who had spent years walking on eggshells around toxic family members had become an advocate for other families facing similar challenges. We had built something new from the wreckage of what we'd lost, something that belonged entirely to us and couldn't be taken away by other people's cruelty or indifference. It wasn't the family I'd imagined Lucas would have, with loving grandparents and supportive aunts and uncles who celebrated his milestones and remembered his birthday. But it was honest and safe and filled with people who showed up consistently, which turned out to be more valuable than the complicated love I'd grown up thinking was normal. The final legal resolution came in October, when my family completed their court-mandated counseling programs, and their probation was officially concluded. Catherine called to let me know that they were now free from court supervision, though the no-contact order would remain in place for another year at my request. "How do you feel about it being over?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. The legal proceedings had given structure to our healing process, clear boundaries around what was and wasn't acceptable behavior, official acknowledgement that what happened to Lucas was criminal rather than just unfortunate. But the real work of rebuilding our lives had happened outside the courtroom, in therapy sessions and school conferences and quiet evenings at home, where Lucas learned to trust that he was safe. "It feels complete," I said finally. Quote, "Not finished. Because healing isn't something you finish, but complete in the sense that we did what we needed to do to protect ourselves. And now we can move forward without looking over our shoulders." That evening, I sat in Lucas's room as he fell asleep, a ritual we'd maintained throughout the most difficult months, and continued because it brought both of us comfort. His breathing was even and peaceful, his small face relaxed in the way that children's faces are when they feel completely secure. I thought about the mother I'd been a year ago, so focused on maintaining family relationships, that I'd lost sight of my primary responsibility to protect my child. I thought about the patterns I'd accepted as normal, because they'd been consistent throughout my life, the way I'd trained myself to absorb other people's anger and disappointment, rather than risk conflict. Most importantly, I thought about the future Lucas would have now, one where he would grow up understanding that love doesn't come with conditions, that family means people who show up when it matters, that his worth isn't determined by other people's approval or disapproval. He would face his own challenges and make his own mistakes, but he would do it with the foundational knowledge that he deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. The last entry I made in the journal I'd kept throughout our legal journey was simple. Today Lucas asked if we could invite his friend Marcus over for Thanksgiving dinner, because Marcus's mom has to work and he'll be alone otherwise. When I said yes, he hugged me and said, "I love that we're the kind of family that makes room for people. That's exactly the kind of family we are now, the kind that makes room for people instead of pushing them away." As I closed the journal and turned off the light in Lucas's room, I realized that this was what victory looked like. Not dramatic courtroom moments or public vindication, but a child who felt safe enough to extend kindness to others, who understood instinctively that families are built through choices rather than genetics, who slept peacefully because he knew the adults in his life would protect him rather than use him. We had started with abandonment and built something beautiful from the ashes of that betrayal. Not the family we'd been born into, but the family we'd chosen to become. And for the first time in my adult life, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.